Clara stood at the front of the grand hall, the scent of lilies and old money thick in the air, watching as the mahogany casket of her father, Arthur Thorne, was lowered. She was 25, wearing a black dress that felt too heavy for her slender frame, and her grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest until it ached. Her sister, Vivian, 10 years older and a study in polished, effortless control, approached from the side, a silver-edged shawl draped over her shoulders. Vivian's hand settled on Clara's back, a gesture that felt less like comfort and more like possession. "Be strong, little sister," Vivian murmured, her voice a low, throaty purr that never quite reached her cold eyes. "It's what Daddy would have wanted. And, Aegis Global needs a firm hand now. A steady, adult hand." The reading of the will the following Tuesday was not a somber ritual, but a corporate performance. The old lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, a nervous, jolly man who had worked for their father for 40 years, cleared his throat repeatedly before beginning. Clara sat alone on a velvet couch, expecting the split to be equitable. Arthur Thorne had always prided himself on fairness, on building a legacy for both his daughters. The first 20 minutes detailed the numerous trusts, charities, and minor asset dissolutions. Then came the heart of the estate, Aegis Global, the multinational tech company that was Arthur's life's blood and the foundation of the Thorne fortune. Clara leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly, ready to begin the next chapter of her life as a co-owner, a partner. Mr. Abernathy adjusted his glasses and delivered the fatal blow without a flicker of remorse. "To my daughter, Clara Thorne, I leave an annuity of $50,000 a year, to be paid monthly, with no claim or stake in the company." The words hung in the silence like shards of broken glass. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She looked across the room at Vivian, who was sitting perfectly still, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. Then, the lawyer continued, his voice taking on a tone of profound legal gravitas. "And to my daughter, Vivian Thorne, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including 100% ownership and control of Aegis Global." Clara didn't cry. The shock was too pure, too absolute for tears. Her father, the man who had taught her to ride a bike and to love the stars, had just dismissed her entire future with a sum that wouldn't even cover the mortgage on the house she grew up in. She stood, not stumbling, but with a strange, unnatural rigidity. She met Vivian's gaze. Her sister offered a slight, triumphant inclination of her head, a silent acknowledgement of her victory. It was a calculated, brutal betrayal, not just of money, but of love, trust, and the fundamental bond of family. Clara walked out of the room, hearing Vivian's saccharine voice thanking the lawyer for his thoroughness as she went. Hours later, Clara found herself back in her father's study at the empty house, the last room she had access to before Vivian changed the locks. The room was already sterile, most of his personal effects already boxed up by estate cleaners. Clara slumped into her father's favorite reading chair, the leather worn smooth and comforting beneath her fingers. She wasn't looking for a sign or a secret. She was just seeking the ghost of his presence. As she sank back, a piece of tape, a small, faded strip of beige electrical tape, caught her eye beneath the seat cushion. Her father was meticulous, almost pathologically neat. Nothing was ever taped down. With trembling fingers, she peeled the tape back. Underneath, securely affixed to the frame, was a tiny, old-fashioned micro-cassette recorder, its metallic casing cool beneath her touch. It was labeled in his familiar, sloping script, a script that suddenly felt like a lifeline. For Clara, if the worst happens. Clara stared at the micro-cassette recorder in her hand, the old-school technology feeling strangely heavy and menacing. Her father, a titan of the digital world, had chosen this archaic, analog device, a piece of technology impossible to trace or hack. It was a calculated choice, a silent testament to the depth of the betrayal he must have feared. The tape itself was worn, as if it had been recorded and re-recorded multiple times before the final, desperate message was laid down. For a terrifying second, she almost didn't press play. Ignorance was a kind of warmth, and the truth, she knew, would be an ice bath. But Vivian's smug, triumphant face, the one she'd seen at the will reading, solidified her resolve. She found an old Walkman in a drawer and, with a shaky hand, pressed the tiny, triangular play button. At first, the tape was agonizingly silent, just the hiss of static. Clara held her breath, convinced it was a dead end, a sentimental note from a dying man. Then, a voice, unmistakably her father's, but strained, whisper-thin, and laced with panic, cut through the noise. It wasn't the strong, commanding voice she remembered from the boardroom. It was the voice of a man profoundly afraid. He spoke in short, broken bursts, detailing his growing concern over Vivian's sudden, aggressive takeover of his internal duties in the final 6 months of his life. He mentioned missing documents, forced digital signatures, and an unusual level of surveillance from his older daughter. He said he had tried to change the will back, to ensure the 50-50 split he always intended, but that Vivian had blocked his access, using a power of attorney he could no longer recall signing. The realization settled over Clara like a shroud. The rivalry between the two sisters was not a simple matter of sibling competition. It was a deeply rooted, decades-long sickness of the soul, and her father had been its final victim. She recalled the history, how Vivian, from the moment she realized her younger sister possessed an innate, easy charm that she lacked, had dedicated her life to diminishing Clara. It started small, stealing credit for a middle school art project, later convincing their parents that Clara was too flighty for a serious university major, and culminating in the constant, undermining whispers that chipped away at Clara's self-esteem. Vivian's ultimate goal wasn't wealth. It was to prove she was the only one worthy of the Thorne name and legacy. The tape crackled, and her father's whisper became marginally louder, fueled by a final, desperate surge of lucidity. "I tried, Clara, I tried to protect you. She moved too fast. She has the old lawyer, Abernathy, under her thumb, and the documents, they look real. They look perfectly legal." His voice faded into a ragged cough, the sound of a man fighting for his last breath. Clara's eyes burned, not with tears of grief, but with the searing heat of a horrifying truth. Her sister hadn't simply received the inheritance. She had orchestrated a hostile takeover of her father's life, and quite possibly his death. This wasn't a family dispute, this was a crime. The final words on the tape were the hardest to make out, just a faint, chilling whisper that demanded absolute silence to hear. It was Arthur Thorne's last testament, a whispered warning cutting through the veil of legality and deceit. After a long, ragged exhale, the sound barely audible above the static, came the accusation that shattered the last vestiges of Clara's innocence, demanding vengeance as the only possible response. "She forged it, Clara. The signature, she forged it." The phrase from the tape, "she forged it," had ceased to be a mere accusation. It was the new, terrifying gravity of Clara's world. The whisper didn't bring solace or closure, but a cold, driving mandate for action. She left the house that day not as a grieving daughter, but as an investigator tasked with proving her father's final, harrowing truth. The weight of the tiny cassette recorder in her pocket was heavier than all the millions Vivian had stolen. Clara needed something concrete, something a court would recognize over the desperate final plea of a dead man. She began by mentally dissecting the last year of Arthur Thorne's life, searching for the breadcrumbs he must have scattered, the silent cries for help that she had been too blind with love and trust to see. Her mind replayed the strange, unsettling shifts in his personality. The man who lived and breathed technology had suddenly developed a profound, almost obsessive interest in antiquated legal procedures. He had pressed her to read dense, obscure textbooks, specifically citing clauses related to corporate succession, probate law, and the terrifying fine print of a durable power of attorney. At the time, she dismissed it as the eccentric habit of an aging intellectual. Now, she recognized it as a frantic, coded education, his last-ditch attempt to arm her with the knowledge she would need when he could no longer speak. He was teaching her how to fight the war he knew was coming, without ever being able to name the enemy. The most profound clue, however, was the smallest. 3 days before he collapsed, her father had insisted on teaching her a rarely used and obscure chess move he called the Dresden defense, a maneuver meant to sacrifice a pawn in order to save the queen. His final, encrypted text message to her, sent just hours before Vivian supposedly took over his access, contained only the single word, Dresden. It clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. This was the encrypted key to his secondary financial vault, a secret act of rebellion against Vivian's systematic surveillance. The betrayal wasn't a sudden, single act of theft. It was the slow, calculated poisoning of a vulnerable man's final months, leaving him just enough consciousness to send one final warning to the daughter he truly loved. Clara contacted an old, independent lawyer, Bernard Shaw, a man known for his integrity, rather than relying on the corrupted Abernathy. She played the tape, then laid the official will on his mahogany desk. Shaw, after scrutinizing the document's signature block, shook his head. Clara, this signature is meticulous. If it is a forgery, it's a masterwork. On its face, this document is ironclad. It adheres to all witnessing protocols. However, as he compared the crisp, clean lines of the signature to known samples of Arthur's shaky final letters, a tiny furrow appeared between his brows. The signature was too perfect, too robust for a man in Arthur's diminished state. The document was flawless, and that was its flaw. He pointed to a name scrawled on the witness line beneath Abernathy's, Elias Vance. Vance was a junior partner at Abernathy's firm. Brilliant kid, meticulous, a stickler for procedure. Shaw paused, leaning back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. He assisted in the final filing of this will, signed off on all the legalities, and then, immediately afterward, he vanished. Resigned without notice, didn't answer calls, disappeared off the face of the earth. People like Vance don't just walk away from a fast-track partnership. The will looks legal, but the only man who could confirm the legality of the signatures and witnessing procedure has not only gone missing, he did so the very day Vivian Thorne took full control of Aegis Global. The vanishing act of Elias Vance was the confirmation Clara desperately needed. It wasn't just a simple forgery, it was a conspiracy, a meticulously crafted legal coup executed by Vivian. Vance was the loose end, the paid accomplice who was immediately scrubbed from the picture once the theft was finalized. The realization hardened Clara's spine, replacing the dull ache of loss with a sharp, focused intensity. She wasn't just fighting for money or an inheritance. She was fighting for her father's reputation and to expose a cold-blooded criminal. She knew the police, even if she approached them now, would dismiss her claims as the rantings of a scorned, disinherited child, easily neutralized by Vivian's expensive team of corporate lawyers. Vivian, meanwhile, was not wasting time consolidating her ill-gotten gains. Her first major move as the undisputed CEO of Aegis Global was the brutal and swift sale of every tangible asset that held sentimental value for Clara. The childhood home, a sprawling, beloved estate overlooking the coastline, was listed and sold within 2 weeks to a shell corporation, the intent clearly to demolish it and erase the memory of Arthur Thorne's first family life. When Clara went to retrieve a few final boxes, she was met by a stern, uniformed guard who presented her with a legal notice detailing her permanent exclusion from the property, signed with a flourish by Vivian. The demolition crew was already mobilizing in the driveway. But the final, crushing blow to Clara's emotional reserves came with the news about the Arthur Thorne Charitable Foundation. This foundation, dedicated to funding arts education for underprivileged youth, was her father's pride and joy, the only part of his wealth he believed truly mattered. Vivian, citing unsustainable operational costs and a need to streamline assets, moved to liquidate the foundation's endowment, folding the cash into Aegis Global's operational budget. The small team of dedicated staff, including Clara's old mentor, were all dismissed. This action was not about business. It was a declaration of war against her father's memory, a final, spiteful effort to eradicate anything Clara could still hold dear. Clara stood outside the now-shuttered foundation office, watching the sign being taken down. The wind whipped her hair around her face, and she felt a desolation deeper than anything she had experienced before. Vivian hadn't just stolen her future, she was actively dismantling her past. It was here, in the cold, public humiliation of losing her last connection to her father, that the true, terrifying scope of Vivian's ambition became clear. Vivian didn't just want the company or the power. She wanted Clara Thorne utterly and completely erased from the family narrative and any position of societal influence. Standing amidst the debris of her shattered life, Clara knew she could no longer remain the naive, heartbroken daughter. The annuity Vivian had granted her, a pittance meant to keep her silent and comfortable in a powerless obscurity, was an insult. She made a silent, ice-cold vow. She would not accept the golden handcuffs. She would not disappear. Her revenge would not be fast or loud, but slow, meticulous, and total. She would become something Vivian couldn't recognize, couldn't manipulate, and, most importantly, couldn't destroy. Clara Thorne was gone. It was time for a predator to emerge. Clara was living in a tiny, rented studio apartment, the walls thin enough to hear her neighbor's television, a jarring contrast to the silence of her father's grand estate. The $50,000 annuity, the golden handcuff Vivian had thrown her way, had been rejected immediately and publicly, sent back to Abernathy with a succinct, scathing legal note. Rejected. Will contest pending. This act of defiance was the first step in her transformation, a signal to Vivian that she would not be bought or silenced. But defiance wouldn't pay the rent or fund a war against Aegis Global. She needed the money her father had desperately tried to secure for her. She returned to the final, encrypted email her father had sent, the one that contained only the image of an obscure Greek mythological figure. It wasn't Zeus or Athena, it was an image of Hecate, the goddess of crossroads, witchcraft, and hidden knowledge. Clara's blood ran cold. Hecate wasn't just a random image. It was Vivian's childhood nickname, a name their father had given her in a moment of dark, ironic humor after a particularly vicious display of jealousy. It was the key. He had used the one name only he, Vivian, and Clara knew to be a signpost for something secret, something hidden. Working with a borrowed, state-of-the-art encryption key he'd also left hidden, Clara used the nickname Hecate as the final layer of the password. After 3 agonizing attempts, the encrypted file burst open, revealing not documents, but a comprehensive list of offshore accounts, trusts, and hidden digital assets spread across 4 continents. This wasn't just a savings account. It was a shadow empire of legitimate wealth, perfectly insulated from Aegis Global's direct operations and, crucially, completely unknown to Vivian. Her father had been planning for this catastrophe for years, creating a financial escape route for his true heir. The total was staggering, a sum that wasn't just comfortable, but genuinely transformative, enough to hire the best lawyers, private investigators, and financial analysts in the world. But mixed in with the ledgers of legitimate wealth were darker secrets, coded entries detailing initial, petty embezzlement schemes Vivian had run in her early years at Aegis, small, almost insignificant frauds that proved her moral decay was not a recent development. Clara realized her sister wasn't just a corporate thief. She was a career criminal who had simply scaled up her operation over time. The money was a weapon, but the evidence was the bomb. As Clara began the methodical process of moving and securing the funds, preparing for a long, drawn-out war, her laptop flickered to a national news report. The churn across the bottom of the screen was stark and inescapable. Vivian Thorne named one of top 50 women to watch in global tech. Aegis Global stock soars. The accompanying photograph showed Vivian, radiant and poised, accepting an award in a glittering ceremony. She was not just getting away with it. She was being celebrated for it. Clara looked at the picture, at the fake smile, the cultivated glamour, the sheer arrogance of her deception. She closed the laptop, the screen reflecting her own face, now stripped of softness, etched with a quiet, lethal resolve. The revenge would not be a contest of wills. It would be the dismantling of a publicly worshipped idol. The quiet girl was ready to study the art of war. The immense wealth, once a source of potential salvation, now felt like a heavy burden, a constant, chilling reminder of the price her father had paid. Clara started by putting every single hidden asset into a secure, anonymous holding structure, funding her war chest. But she was not ready for the devastating intelligence that arrived next, a piece of information that twisted the knife of betrayal and redefined Vivian's treachery from corporate theft to something monstrously personal. She had hired a private investigator, a former corporate security expert named Simon Voss, a man whose face was etched with the weariness of seeing the worst of human nature. Voss's initial report detailed the forgery, the manipulation of the will, and the forced disappearance of Elias Vance, all the crimes Clara already suspected. But then came the single paragraph that made the air freeze in her tiny apartment. Voss had tracked down the nursing agency Arthur Thorne used in his final months. He discovered that the high-profile, highly recommended agency had rotated staff immediately after the will was changed. One nurse, a woman named Eliza Vance, no relation to the missing lawyer, but a cruel coincidence, had been fired without cause immediately following Arthur's death. Voss tracked her to a small, isolated town and convinced her to talk, promising full anonymity. The confession was damning. Eliza confirmed that Vivian had visited the house frequently in the final weeks, often alone with Arthur, dismissing the other staff. She didn't talk business. She talked medication. Vivian had approached the nurse, subtly at first, then with escalating, cash-fueled demands, to alter the timing and dosage of Arthur's heart medication. Nothing fatal, nothing that would raise immediate red flags during a routine postmortem. Just enough to cause increased stress on the system, to hasten the inevitable end of a man already battling a fragile heart. Vivian hadn't killed her father in a dramatic fashion. She had ordered a slow, clinical execution, a death that mimicked natural causes. Clara dropped the phone. The shock was physical, a nauseating punch to the gut. She walked to the bathroom, catching her reflection in the steamed-up mirror. A stranger with hollow eyes, the last vestiges of her youthful kindness violently stripped away. The betrayal was no longer just about money or position. Vivian hadn't just stolen the inheritance. She had, with chilling premeditation, hired the nurse that subtly changed their father's medication schedule. The theft of the money was merely a consequence of the murder. Grief, which had been a slow, manageable ache, now transformed into a seismic wave of white-hot, purified hatred. There was no going back. There could be no forgiveness, no mercy, and no peace until justice was served. The image of Vivian, smiling brightly on the news, now evoked not just anger, but a primal, visceral need for retribution. Clara stood absolutely still, the world outside, the city noise, the neighbor's TV, fading into a dull, meaningless hum. The old Clara Thorne, the soft, trusting sister, died right there in that sterile bathroom, replaced by a vessel for a singular, crystalline purpose. Her father deserved justice, and she would be the instrument of his righteous wrath. The revelation of the medical sabotage was the forge that hardened Clara's soul. She spent 3 days in a silent, solitary vigil, replaying the tape, rereading Voss's report, and staring at the small, cheap burial marker that was all Vivian allowed for their father. Every memory of Vivian, every shared birthday, every secret whispered in the dark, every strained family holiday, was re-examined through the prism of this final, monstrous betrayal. It wasn't just coldness, it was pure, unadulterated malice, a psychopathic ruthlessness that had been carefully hidden behind a facade of corporate ambition. There was no more space for grief. That emotion had been consumed entirely by the fierce, protective rage she felt for the memory of the man Vivian had systematically extinguished. The soft, art history major who loved quiet evenings and old books was dead. In her place was a strategist, fueled by a single, powerful mandate, to utterly dismantle the life and legacy Vivian had built on a foundation of lies and murder. Her first act was symbolic, a severance of all past identities. She deleted every piece of her online existence, social media, old email accounts, even her undergraduate alumni profile. Clara Thorne, the vulnerable, predictable victim, was gone. She needed a new name, a new persona that carried the weight of her conviction and the anonymity necessary for her mission. She chose Elara Vane. Elara for the light she was determined to cast on Vivian's darkness, and Vane for the emptiness of the life she was leaving behind. With the wealth her father had secured, Elara's focus became singular and immediate: education. She booked a one-way flight to a country known for having the most rigorous, Darwinian business schools in the world, a place where ethics were secondary to victory, and where the curriculum was less about theory and more about the bare-knuckled fight for market dominance. She enrolled under her new identity, her father's encrypted assets funding her brutal, accelerated studies. Her classmates saw a quiet, intensely focused woman who never socialized, whose eyes held a distant, unsettling focus. They assumed she was chasing money. In truth, she was chasing a ghost. Elara's life became a grueling cycle of all-night study sessions, financial modeling, and the obsessive tracking of Aegis Global's quarterly reports. Sleep was a luxury, replaced by the bitter, invigorating certainty of her purpose. She learned to speak the language of finance, a cold, dispassionate dialect of leverage, hostile bids, and asset restructuring that was designed to strip all humanity from business. She absorbed it all, not to lead ethically, but to learn how Vivian played the game, where the weak points were, and how to deliver a fatal, undeniable blow. Vengeance was not an emotion. It was the most demanding, all-consuming career she had ever known. It was during a grueling 10-week immersion course in corporate security and industrial espionage that Elara received the final, defining piece of information that cemented her path. A brief news alert flashed across a terminal during a market simulation exercise. It reported that Vivian Thorne, capitalizing on her newfound control, had successfully negotiated a massive, predatory contract, quadrupling Aegis Global's valuation overnight. The article hailed her as a visionary. The image of Vivian's triumphant face, superimposed on the success of a company she had acquired through murder, extinguished the last tiny flicker of the old Clara's doubt. The time for grieving was over. The time for learning was now. Elara Vane would return not as a person, but as the perfect weapon. The years Elara spent in the crucible of elite business education were a blur of caffeine, balance sheets, and ruthless competition. She worked with a laser focus that unnerved her peers. She wasn't seeking knowledge. She was forging armor. She mastered the art of leverage, the subtlety of corporate espionage, and the necessary psychological distance required to treat people as data points. Her accent changed, shedding the soft, almost naive inflections of her childhood for the crisp, transnational neutrality of a global financier. She didn't make friends. She made observations. The ghost of her father was her only confidant, and the promise of Vivian's fall was the only reward she sought. Elara's thesis project was a chillingly accurate deconstruction of Aegis Global's acquisition strategy, identifying every financial vulnerability, every key personnel weakness, and every legal loophole. She wasn't just analyzing the company, she was drawing the blueprints for its destruction. Her professors were awed by her brilliance and terrified by her lack of humanity. They called her a prodigy, never realizing the source of her drive was not ambition, but a decade of simmering, ice-cold hatred. She funded her education entirely through smart, aggressive short-term investments, turning the initial inheritance into a formidable war chest, a testament to her father's foresight and her own chilling aptitude for the game. To maintain her facade of independence, Elara worked 4 simultaneous high-level consulting gigs, each in a different sector: supply chain logistics, high-frequency trading, software development, and intellectual property law. She didn't need the money. She needed the access, the network, and the intricate knowledge of how interlocking global industries worked. She was becoming a master of convergence, building a unique skill set that made her irreplaceable in any boardroom. Every late night, every canceled holiday, every moment of self-denial was a sacrifice made at the altar of her coming vengeance. She cultivated an image of the brilliant, uncompromising operative, the one who asked difficult questions and always delivered results. The day of her graduation arrived, quiet and anticlimactic. Elara stood in the back of the auditorium, a woman in a sea of celebratory caps and gowns, wearing an expression of grim satisfaction. The final phase of her plan was about to begin. She watched the proceedings with clinical detachment, waiting for the pomp and circumstance to end. Then, the dean stepped forward to introduce the keynote speaker, a shining example of global leadership and entrepreneurial success. The name echoed through the hall, hitting Elara with the force of a physical blow. The keynote speaker, radiant in a bespoke suit, commanding the stage with effortless arrogance, was Vivian Thorne. She spoke of vision, resilience, and the hard choices required for success, all veiled justifications for her own crimes. Elara watched her sister, separated by a chasm of years and lies, now only 50 feet away. Vivian didn't see her. The new Elara Vane was a masterpiece of controlled anonymity, her features honed by focus, her expression a mask of professional disinterest. As Vivian accepted a standing ovation from the crowd, Elara turned to leave, her own diploma clutched tight in her hand. She had achieved the impossible. She had spent years building the perfect strategic arsenal, and her primary target had just walked right into the range of fire, utterly oblivious. Vivian Thorne, her victim, had just personally delivered her graduation speech. Elara left the auditorium without a word, the sound of Vivian's self-congratulatory applause echoing distantly behind her. The close encounter wasn't a risk, it was a psychological test, and Vivian had failed spectacularly by not even noticing her. This was the terrifying advantage Elara possessed. She knew everything about Vivian, while Vivian knew nothing about Elara Vane. The next step required moving from strategic planning to tactical implementation, and for that, she needed to bring her only trusted asset back into play. She called Simon Voss, the private detective, her voice devoid of any warmth. Voss, a man whose life was built on cynicism, was still surprised by the icy efficiency of the woman on the other end of the line. She gave him a new, chilling mandate. I'm no longer interested in proving the forgery or the medication change. That evidence is secured and will be the final stroke. Now, I need to know her present vulnerabilities. Not Aegis Global's balance sheets. I know those better than she does. I need her personal Achilles heel. Elara explained that she needed a point of psychological entry, a lever that, when pulled, would shatter Vivian's composure and public facade before the final legal hammer fell. Voss's investigation into Vivian's personal life yielded a swift and unsettling report. Vivian, despite her corporate prowess, was profoundly insecure, constantly seeking validation through external symbols of success. This included her husband, Marcus Harrington, an investment banker who served as a trophy spouse. Marcus projected wealth and competence, but the reality was a meticulously maintained deception. He was addicted to high-stakes, high-leverage deals, and more recently, to high-limit gambling and exclusive, unregulated overseas markets. The report detailed his crippling debt to a dangerous consortium of organized financiers who were beginning to circle. Elara read the report with a cold, professional thrill. Marcus wasn't a liability. He was a beautifully wrapped, ticking bomb. Vivian's relentless drive for success had blinded her to the rot at the heart of her own life. She was so focused on maintaining her corporate empire that she had missed the far more immediate threat posed by her own husband's spiraling recklessness and his willingness to use Aegis Global's resources to cover his private losses. The key was clear. Marcus was already using Aegis Global funds, funneled through complex, hidden investment vehicles, to stave off his menacing creditors. This was the perfect entry point. Elara's revenge would not begin with a frontal assault on Aegis Global, which was too well defended. It would begin with a subtle, insidious dismantling of Vivian's personal security and the exposure of the man who served as her emotional, and now, financial, weakness. She felt a cold, calculating satisfaction, a feeling that had entirely eclipsed all memory of sisterly affection. She had learned the rules of this new game, and she intended to play them with absolute ruthlessness. Elara smiled, the first true, cold smile in 10 years, a grim, private celebration of her newfound focus. Perfect, she whispered to the empty room, her voice a low, lethal promise. The attack begins not with the queen, but the king. With Marcus Harrington identified as the strategic weak point, Elara began to meticulously lay the groundwork for his downfall. She wasn't just planning to expose his debt. She was going to use it as a Trojan horse to infiltrate the very structure Vivian was so desperately trying to protect. Marcus was a partner at a prestigious global investment firm, and Aegis Global was one of his most profitable clients, a nexus of immense and largely unsupervised transactions. Elara's goal was simple: to get close enough to Marcus to make his worst decisions seem like his best, accelerating his path to public ruin. Leveraging her father's perfectly clean, hidden funds, Elara created a shell company named Veritas Strategic, specializing in turnaround acquisitions and high-risk capital management. This was her first overt move onto the global stage. Her pitch to Marcus's firm was simple and enticing. Veritas had identified a massive, undervalued acquisition opportunity in the biotech sector, one too complex and high leverage for traditional banks, but with the potential for explosive returns, exactly the kind of high-stakes gamble Marcus desperately needed to cover his mounting debts. She ensured her resume, submitted under the name Elara Vane, was a masterpiece of selective truth, impeccable credentials, a focus on aggressive restructuring, and a deliberate omission of any personal history. The story she fed his firm was that she was a secretive, brilliant financier with a bottomless war chest and a penchant for impossible wins. Marcus, already panicked by the consortium's tightening grip and the looming threat of exposure, took the bait. He championed Veritas, convincing his partners that Elara Vane was the necessary genius to save their firm from stagnation. Elara's true intent became clear in the contractual structure of the deal. She engineered the agreement so that Veritas Strategic, while appearing to be an independent partner, would have direct, unrestricted oversight into the specific investment vehicle Marcus was managing within Aegis Global. This gave her access to the exact financial pipelines he was siphoning off to pay his debts. She was not just auditing the books, she was placing a camera directly inside his private, illegal vault. The level of complexity required to secure this position was staggering, but Elara's immersion in corporate law and finance made the impossible possible. The internal announcement at Marcus's firm hailed Elara Vane as a visionary new consultant. Vivian, distracted by the everyday demands of running Aegis, saw the name but dismissed it as another brilliant, interchangeable financier playing at the periphery of her empire. She didn't recognize the cold, coiled threat she had just allowed into her innermost circle. Elara, sitting in her new, opulent office overlooking the cityscape, felt the satisfaction of the first clean, strategic strike. She had positioned herself perfectly. The bomb was primed. The very next morning, the financial world experienced a sudden, violent shock. The stock of the targeted biotech company, the one Marcus's firm had been preparing to acquire, plunged by 30% overnight due to a seemingly random, perfectly timed, and devastating exposure of its inflated patents. It was a calculated market manipulation executed by Veritas Strategic. Elara had orchestrated the crash before the deal closed, maximizing the panic. Her phone rang immediately. It was a conference call featuring a furious, screaming Vivian Thorne, demanding answers from her husband and his firm about the catastrophic valuation drop. Vivian's first question, laced with panic and corporate fury, was simple and chilling. Who is this Elara Vane? And why did she just tank the valuation of our latest acquisition? The voice of Vivian Thorne, usually a smooth instrument of corporate power, was frayed with genuine panic on the conference call. She was railing against Marcus and his partners, utterly blind to the fact that the person who orchestrated the financial catastrophe was currently listening in on the call, her presence an undetectable shadow in the digital ether. Elara maintained her professional silence, letting the chaos unfold. Vivian's fury wasn't about the lost opportunity, it was about the loss of control. It was the first, delicious taste of seeing her sister rattled, and Elara savored the moment. The purpose of the initial market manipulation was achieved. It made Elara Vane a necessary figure. Marcus, desperate to salvage the deal and his reputation, pushed for an immediate, high-stakes meeting between his firm, Aegis Global's key stakeholders, and the brilliant, ruthless consultant who seemed to possess a crystal ball for market volatility. The meeting was set for a glass-walled conference room high above the city, a place designed to project dominance, but which now felt like a cage for Vivian. Elara arrived early, dressed in a sharp, anonymous charcoal suit, her hair pulled back severely, her face a carefully constructed mask of disinterest. She was utterly unrecognizable. The meeting began, and Vivian entered with a forced air of superiority, her handshake brief and icy. She looked at Elara with intense scrutiny, not because she recognized her, but because she recognized the threat of true competence. Elara met her gaze, a cold, steady blue that betrayed nothing of the decade of simmering vengeance, and gave a neutral, professional nod. The discussion was all business jargon: liquidity, leverage, hostile vulnerabilities. Elara spoke with precision and authority, deconstructing the flaw in the failed biotech acquisition with chilling clarity. She wasn't aggressive. She was simply right. She spoke of market dynamics and regulatory pitfalls, all the while subtly weaving in language that made Marcus look reckless and Vivian look incompetent for trusting him. She noted the suspiciously rapid movement of capital within Aegis's internal investment vehicles, a veiled reference to Marcus's debt siphoning, which made Vivian's face tighten almost imperceptibly. The emotional tension in the room was suffocating. Vivian, cornered by Elara's undeniable logic, fell back on personal dismissiveness. She tried to undermine Elara's suggestions, questioning her age and experience, but Elara simply presented unassailable data. The power dynamic shifted palpably. Vivian, the CEO, was losing control of her own boardroom narrative to a consultant she had just met. She was fighting a ghost who knew every secret flaw in her armor. As the meeting dissolved, and Marcus's partners scrambled to implement Elara's corrective strategies, Vivian moved swiftly, intercepting Elara near the elevator. Her tone was low, intense, and predatory, seeking a weakness. "Your suggestions are radical, Ms. Vane, and your confidence unsettling." She paused, her eyes searching Elara's face, a flicker of something almost like memory crossing her features. "Your eyes, they remind me of someone I used to know." Elara felt a momentary, electric surge of triumph. She met Vivian's gaze squarely, her expression unchanging, her tone flat and devoid of any warmth, any recognition, any fear. "I'm sure they do," she replied, pulling her hand free from Vivian's grasp. "Many people have blue eyes. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a company to save." The small, chilling encounter by the elevator had confirmed Elara's ultimate psychological advantage: proximity without recognition. Vivian was haunted by a flicker of the past, but her arrogance and decade of unchallenged power prevented her from accepting the truth. This fleeting moment of doubt was precisely what Elara needed to exploit. She wasn't just planning a financial takeover, she was enacting a sustained psychological torture, making Vivian watch as a brilliant, unknown force systematically dismantled her empire. Elara's next move was to fully embed herself in the most critical and vulnerable area of Aegis Global's financing, the Global Asset Investment Fund, GAF, the very vehicle Marcus was using to secretly move company funds. She convinced the executive board, who were now terrified by the market crash, that only an operative of her calculated ruthlessness could stabilize their position. She insisted on total autonomy, arguing that any successful turnaround required swift, surgical action unburdened by committee. The board, desperate to protect their own reputations, gave her the keys. Elara Vane was now officially working inside Aegis Global, a wolf in the shepherd's clothing. Her daily meetings with Marcus became a masterful, agonizing dance. She didn't accuse him, she enabled him. She presented him with a solution to their latest financial woes, a complex, offshore bond offering for a distressed real estate portfolio. This deal was ostensibly high return, but Elara had structurally designed it to be a legal and financial suicide trap. Its complexity was meant to bypass immediate regulatory scrutiny, and its catastrophic failure, when it occurred, would be impossible to hide from the public eye. She watched Marcus's eyes light up with a desperate, greedy hope. He saw salvation, she saw the gallows. Elara's inner life was a constant battle between her focused resolve and the quiet, persistent ghosts of the past. Walking the halls of Aegis Global, the very building her father had poured his soul into, was an agonizing experience. She saw her sister's framed portraits, her awards, the constant, sickening display of success built on a grave. Yet, she maintained her rigid discipline, reminding herself that the old Clara Thorne was weak, and only Elara Vane could deliver justice. She allowed herself no compassion for Marcus. His desperation was merely a tool, his crimes against the company a mirror of Vivian's crimes against her family. The final element of the trap was set when Elara subtly informed Marcus that a critical piece of the bond offering, a due diligence report proving asset viability, would be ready in 2 days. She knew he wouldn't wait. His creditors were closing in, and the desperate need for capital was immediate. As expected, Marcus, panicked and overconfident, attempted to fast-track the deal, forging the necessary sign-offs and bypassing the due diligence report to push the funds through immediately. He had taken the bait and accelerated his own inevitable crash. Late that night, Elara's phone rang. It was an unscheduled, blocked number. A slurring, terrified voice came through the line. It was Marcus Harrington, drunk and completely unraveling. "Who are you?" he sobbed into the phone, his bravado utterly gone. "That acquisition, the bonds. You knew this was a setup. You set me up to fail." He was realizing, in his drunken paranoia, that the brilliant consultant was actually the perfect saboteur. Elara listened to his pitiful accusation, the man's sheer terror palpable in her ear. She let the silence stretch, a vast, condemning emptiness, before she calmly reached out and ended the call, never uttering a single word. The sound of his fear was her reward. Marcus Harrington's panicked accusation was proof that the psychological pressure was working. He hadn't recognized her face, but he had recognized the icy logic of a perfect trap, and that recognition had begun to break his composure. The knowledge that a brilliant, anonymous force was systematically ruining him would now eat away at him, making him sloppy and desperate. Elara didn't need to expose him yet. She just needed to ensure his fear drove him to make an even greater, more public mistake, one that Vivian would be forced to address. The next morning, Elara executed a series of small, rapid-fire transactions within the Global Asset Investment Fund, GAF. These transactions were legally sound, appearing as calculated de-risking maneuvers, but their true purpose was to slightly unbalance the fragile internal accounts Marcus was manipulating. She was pulling the threads of a tapestry, knowing that the central knot was about to unravel. The resulting tremors were too minor for a regulator to notice, but they were catastrophic for Marcus, creating a sudden, urgent need for vast, untraceable capital he could only get from Aegis Global's deepest reserves. In the midst of this controlled chaos, a wave of profound self-doubt hit Elara. She drove to the coastline, to the desolate field where Vivian had demolished her childhood home. Nothing remained but churned earth and weeds. She got out of her sleek, black car and walked onto the scarred land, suddenly overwhelmed by the stench of scorched earth and memory. The old Clara Thorne, the one who loved this place, clawed at the surface of her professional facade. "Is this worth losing myself?" The question echoed in the emptiness. "Am I becoming as cold as she is?" She looked at the horizon, searching for her father's face in the setting sun, terrified that he would look back with disappointment. The answer to her internal crisis arrived not through introspection, but through external malice. As she drove back, a news alert flashed on her dashboard. Vivian Thorne, CEO of Aegis Global, announces strategic restructuring, resulting in the immediate layoff of over 4,000 employees. The article explained that the mass firing was necessary to absorb and mitigate unbudgeted liabilities from the very investment group Marcus and Elara had been dealing with. Vivian was sacrificing thousands of innocent people, the hardworking staff her father had always protected, to cover the financial hemorrhage caused by her husband's and her own reckless avarice. The last flicker of doubt was brutally extinguished. This was not a game. This was a defense of her father's ethical legacy against a malignancy that was consuming everything he built. Vivian's act of corporate cruelty, performed without a moment's hesitation, confirmed that her sister was utterly beyond redemption. The mass layoffs were the trigger. The fear of becoming like Vivian was replaced by the terrifying clarity that only by destroying her sister could she save the people Vivian was now harming. Elara pulled back onto the highway, her composure restored, the ice in her veins colder and more resolute than ever before. The mass layoffs were the final, crucial error in Vivian's strategy. By sacrificing 4,000 livelihoods to cover Marcus's immediate losses, she had not only confirmed her moral bankruptcy, but had also created a powerful, unified opposition within her own organization. The remaining employees were terrified and resentful, and the public scrutiny was intensifying. This provided Elara with the perfect opportunity to make her decisive move, a move so aggressive, so brazen, it would shatter the illusion of Vivian's invincible control. Elara knew that a direct, hostile takeover of Aegis Global was too slow, too messy, and too easily defended. Instead, she chose a more surgical approach. Leveraging the assets her father had saved, she swiftly and quietly acquired a majority stake in Kronos Tech, a struggling but strategically vital competitor to Aegis Global's most profitable, specialized division. Kronos, while smaller, held key patents and market share in an emerging sector that Vivian had foolishly neglected in her rush to consolidate power. This purchase was conducted with flawless anonymity, using a complex network of holding companies designed to mask her identity from even the most sophisticated due diligence team. The moment the acquisition was finalized, Elara transformed Kronos Tech from a failing competitor into a credible, immediate threat. She liquidated non-essential assets, injected massive capital into research and development, and poached several disgruntled, high-level engineers who had been laid off by Vivian. The goal wasn't just competition, it was to create a knife point aimed directly at Aegis Global's throat, forcing Vivian to divert critical attention and resources to fight a new, sudden war. The financial press exploded. The resurrection of Kronos Tech, led by its mysterious, brilliant new owner, sent shockwaves through the market. Analysts called the swift turnaround miraculous. Vivian called it an act of aggression. The stock market, always volatile when facing uncertainty, began to punish Aegis Global, dropping its valuation significantly under the pressure of the new competitive threat. Vivian, already under pressure from the Marcus fallout, was now fighting a war on three fronts: her husband's pending exposure, internal resentment, and an external, brilliantly managed corporate attack. Her reaction was exactly as Elara predicted: arrogance coupled with escalating panic. Unable to identify the attacker and desperate to stabilize her company, Vivian called an emergency meeting of the Aegis Global Board of Directors. She convinced them that the only solution to this existential threat was to hire the very best, most ruthless strategic mind to manage the hostile takeover defense. She needed someone with the capacity for cold, calculated aggression to find and neutralize the person orchestrating the Kronos maneuver. The board, viewing Vivian's leadership as increasingly erratic, reluctantly agreed to her proposal. Hours later, a heavily redacted contract was approved by the board for an outside consultant firm, an anonymous entity that guaranteed results. The consultant's name, delivered via a confidential email to the board chairman, sent a tremor of shock through the already beleaguered executives. The firm was Veritas Strategic, and the strategic consultant chosen to manage the hostile takeover threat against Aegis Global was Elara Vane. The news that Elara Vane, the architect of the market manipulation and the suspected force behind the resurrection of Kronos Tech, was being brought in as the chief strategic consultant for Aegis Global's defense sent a wave of terrified murmurs through the executive suite. The irony was a delicious, agonizing poison for Vivian. She had convinced the board that only someone as ruthless as the attacker could successfully defend them, never once considering the possibility that the attacker was maneuvering to be given the keys to the castle. Vivian was trapped by her own professional pride. She couldn't publicly admit she was losing control, so she had to accept the board's recommendation, even though the name, Elara Vane, grated on her nerves. Elara's arrival at the Aegis Global headquarters wasn't a grand entrance. It was a silent, professional infiltration. She came armed with an ironclad contract that gave her total, unfettered access to all company data, communications, and personnel, precisely the kind of contract Vivian herself would have demanded. Her first act was to take over the corner office directly across the hall from Vivian's, a silent, physical manifestation of her new power and proximity. She immediately summoned key department heads, including the nervous, shell-shocked Marcus, and began to conduct a deep forensic audit, which was, in reality, a systematic search for the final, irrefutable evidence of Vivian's forgery and the paper trail leading back to the nurse, Eliza Vance. Her audit of the Global Asset Investment Fund, GAF, was the key. She used her unprecedented access to confirm every single fraudulent transfer Marcus had made to stave off his mysterious creditors. She didn't stop him. She quietly documented the transfers, allowing the financial hemorrhaging to continue, thus deepening the crisis that justified her presence. She had moved beyond merely setting the trap. She was tightening the noose, allowing the guilty parties to hang themselves with their own desperation. The daily interactions between Elara and Vivian were excruciatingly tense. They met in the corridor, in the board meetings, and often late at night when the offices were silent. Elara maintained her perfect mask, professional, emotionless, and relentlessly focused on the numbers. Vivian was frantic, perpetually stressed, her famous composure cracking under the weight of the unknown threat. She would often corner Elara, not to discuss strategy, but to probe her personal history, searching for the crack in the facade, the memory that haunted her. "Where are you from, Ms. Vane? You have an unusual intensity." Elara's standard reply was a clinical evasion. "My history is irrelevant, Ms. Thorne. My results are all that matter." But in one pivotal, late-night meeting in Vivian's office, as Elara reviewed a key document, Vivian paced behind her, her voice a low snarl of defeat. "This Kronos attack, it's personal. It has to be. Nobody moves this fast, this intelligently, without motive." Elara stood up, turning to face her sister, separated only by the polished mahogany of the desk. She looked at the woman who had stolen her life, and delivered the cold, silent truth of her identity in a single, devastating moment. She didn't speak a name. Instead, she used a single, specific gesture from their shared childhood, a small, dismissive wave of the hand their father had used when he caught Vivian cheating at cards years ago. The wave was meant to signal, "I know what you did." Vivian's eyes widened, her breathing hitched, and the blood drained from her face as she finally recognized the truth hidden behind the brilliant, cold facade. The moment of reckoning was finally here, and Elara was about to walk into her sister's office, not as a consultant, but as the boss. The gesture, the flick of the wrist, a ghost of their father's disapproval, was enough. Vivian's mind, battered by weeks of stress and paranoia, finally snapped the puzzle pieces together. The eyes, the unnerving competence, the intimate knowledge of Aegis's flaws. She stumbled backward, clutching the edge of her massive mahogany desk, her manicured composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. The air in the room became thick with years of unacknowledged guilt and blinding realization. Elara didn't move. She allowed the silence to stretch, weaponizing the moment of recognition, watching her sister's world collapse in her eyes. Then, Elara spoke, her voice low, distinct, and infused with the cadence of their shared youth, a tone she hadn't used in a decade. She didn't use the consulting name or the formal address. She used the affectionate, specific childhood language that only two sisters would share, the playful teasing name Vivian had always hated. "Hello, Vivi." Vivian let out a strangled, visceral sound, half gasp, half scream, that was immediately swallowed by the soundproofing of the luxurious office. "Clara," she choked out, the name a ragged whisper of disbelief and terror. "Clara, you're alive. I thought you disappeared." The immediate relief that Clara hadn't contested the will was instantly eclipsed by the horrifying truth of who this woman now was and why she was standing here. Elara stepped around the desk, invading her sister's personal space, radiating an aura of cold, focused menace. I did disappear, Vivian. I disappeared to learn how to play your game. To learn how to make the right moves, to acquire the right assets, and to become the person who is now sitting in your chair. She gestured to the CEO's leather seat, an act of silent, contemptuous usurpation. You didn't just steal my money, Vivi. You tried to erase me. You killed the only man who ever loved either of us. Vivian tried to rally, reverting to her default mode of manipulation and aggression. Don't be ridiculous. Our father was ill. You have no proof. And I own this company. You're trespassing. Get out. She reached for the panic button concealed beneath her desk, but Elara was faster, slamming her hand down on the mahogany surface, trapping Vivian's trembling fingers. Elara leaned in, her eyes burning with an ancient fire. I have the proof, Vivian. I have the tape. I have the confession from the nurse, Eliza Vance, detailing the dosage change. I have the paper trail proving the forgery. And I have the sworn deposition of the missing lawyer, Elias Vance, who you paid to disappear. Elara paused, the finality of her words crushing her sister's will. You didn't just steal the company. You committed murder. And I am not a scorned sister seeking revenge. I am the CEO of your fate. Vivian collapsed back into her chair, her face a mask of terror and sudden, absolute comprehension. The brilliance, the ruthlessness, the proximity. It had all been a slow, inevitable march to this room. She was defeated not by a government or a court, but by the sister she had dismissed as insignificant. The last shred of corporate dignity vanished as she broke, tears finally streaming down her face, a grotesque parody of the grief she should have shown for their father. I can fix this, Clara. We're family. We can cover this up. We can rule together. Vivian's frantic plea for partnership was met with Elara's unyielding silence. The suggestion that they could somehow whitewash murder and corporate theft solidified Elara's conviction. There was no remorse, only self-preservation. Family? Elara asked, the word brittle and cold. You destroyed our family, Vivian, the moment you paid a nurse to hasten our father's death. There is no we. There is only justice. Elara didn't waste time on sentiment. She laid out the inevitable future with the chilling precision of a corporate presentation. She had evidence of the forgery, the murder, and Marcus's wire fraud, all perfectly cross-referenced and legally secured. She gave Vivian her final, non-negotiable ultimatum: resign immediately and publicly, claiming ill health, and face a massive civil suit from the estate, or remain CEO and face immediate criminal prosecution for murder and forgery. The choice was public disgrace and financial ruin, or a guaranteed life sentence in prison. The pressure cooker exploded. Vivian, realizing the full extent of the legal and personal trap, snapped. Her eyes, usually so calculated, filled with a wild, desperate rage. She screamed, overturning her crystal water carafe, sending shards of glass skittering across the floor. If I fall, you fall with me, she shrieked, her voice raw with hysteria. She lunged for a priceless, heavy glass statue on her credenza, a corporate award from her first year at Aegis. Elara was prepared. She had learned long ago that cornered predators were the most dangerous. As Vivian raised the statue, a silent protocol, already in place, was executed. While her sister was distracted by her physical attack, Elara pressed a concealed button under the desk, the counter-panic measure. This action immediately triggered the simultaneous release of two separate, devastating packages of information. The first was an anonymous, perfectly timed dossier sent to every major financial regulator and the entire Aegis Global board. It detailed, with irrefutable proof, Marcus Harrington's decade-long pattern of leveraging company assets to cover private debt and his specific wire fraud involving the offshore bonds. The timing was engineered to maximize panic and regulatory intervention. The second package went to three carefully chosen, ethically driven investigative journalists. It provided the deep, contextual evidence of the fraudulent will, the disappearing lawyer, and the subsequent mass layoffs. This was the true bomb, aimed not at the company's financials, but at Vivian's public reputation. It was the story of Clara Thorne, the disinherited sister, and Vivian Thorne, the corporate killer. The result was instantaneous. Before Vivian could even swing the heavy statue, her phone, her computer, and the office television all began to flash with breaking news. Not about a violent confrontation, but about her husband's immediate arrest for high-level fraud and the subsequent plunge of Aegis Global stock price by over 50% in the initial minutes of panic trading. The public exposure had begun. Vivian froze, the statue heavy and useless in her hand, staring at the financial carnage unfolding on the screens. She had tried to bargain with a life, and Elara had responded by dismantling the very foundation of her identity. Moments later, the heavy door to the office burst open. It wasn't security, but two clean-cut, grim-faced federal marshals who had been alerted by Elara's strategic leaks and Marcus's arrest. They weren't there for the murder. That was complex. They were there for the easier, faster crime. Vivian Thorne, you are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, securities manipulation, and insider trading. The poetic justice was complete. Vivian was arrested not for the emotional crime of murder, but for the corporate crimes that defined her soul, in the very office that symbolized her stolen success. The public fall of Vivian Thorne was a spectacle worthy of the Greek tragedy she had unwittingly played a part in. Arrested in her opulent office, led out past the stunned board members and the few remaining employees, she was stripped of every pretense of power. The visual, the immaculate, once celebrated CEO being led away in handcuffs, was the final, devastating image Elara knew would destroy her sister's standing forever. The corporate crime was merely the mechanism. The true punishment was the public humiliation and the total loss of control. Elara, having delivered the initial blow, stepped back, allowing the machinery of the law and the ravenous press to finish the job. She spent the next 2 days in a sterile, silent boardroom, not celebrating, but meticulously overseeing the fallout. Aegis Global was in freefall, its stock cratered, its leadership decapitated. The company needed a lifeline, and the board, desperate to prevent a total collapse and facing shareholder revolt, was forced to turn to the only person with the strategic knowledge and capital to save them, the mysterious, brilliant consultant. In a grim, emergency vote, the board installed Elara Vane as the interim CEO of the restructured Aegis Global. The irony was palpable. Vivian's final, desperate act of survival, hiring the enemy, had cleared the path for her sister's ascendance. Elara sat in the CEO chair, the leather still slightly warm from her sister's departure. She felt no triumph, only a quiet, resolute satisfaction. Her focus immediately shifted from vengeance to stewardship. Her first act was a public address to the remaining employees, a speech that was devoid of corporate jargon and full of raw, human honesty. She promised a complete ethical cleansing, a restoration of the values Arthur Thorne had always preached. She signed the paperwork to fully reinstate the Arthur Thorne Charitable Foundation, directing a massive injection of capital to repair the damage Vivian had inflicted. This was the moment Elara truly ceased to be just Elara Vane and began the process of becoming Clara Thorne, CEO and heir. The final piece of the criminal puzzle arrived in the form of a heavily sealed envelope delivered by Simon Voss. The detective had used the chaos of the arrest to quietly secure the cooperation of Eliza Vance, the nurse. Afraid of being implicated in the rapidly unfolding scandals, Eliza had given a full, detailed, and notarized confession about Vivian's demands and the altered medication schedule. Voss included a short, handwritten note from the nurse, a final, chilling sentence that spoke to the wider wreckage of Vivian's ambition. Vivian ruined us all. With the confession of Eliza Vance secured, the murder charge became inevitable, though the public focus remained on the high-profile financial crimes. The legal battle that followed was less a defense and more a negotiation of surrender. Vivian, stripped of her assets and her powerful lawyers, watched as her empire was legally dismantled. Marcus, facing his own long prison sentence, had already turned on her, providing testimony that cemented her role in the corporate frauds. The sister who had always won was finally and completely defeated. Clara, now officially the permanent CEO of the restructured Aegis Global, attended the sentencing, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom. She wasn't seeking spectacle. She was seeking closure. Vivian, pale and ravaged, looked nothing like the radiant woman who had accepted awards a year earlier. The judge, in delivering the maximum sentence for the financial crimes, spoke not only of the laws broken but of the catastrophic betrayal of public and corporate trust. The severity of the sentence reflected the depth of the deception. After the gavel fell, sealing Vivian's fate to decades in a federal penitentiary, Clara made one final, necessary visit. She went to the cemetery and, using the vast resources of the now-reformed Aegis Global, relocated her father's simple grave to a quiet, serene family plot, commissioning a beautiful, honest marker. She stood there, feeling the wind on her face, finally releasing the decade of tension that had coiled in her chest. She had secured the confession, ensured the justice, and reclaimed the company, transforming it into the ethical, visionary enterprise her father intended. She had won the war, but the spoils weren't money. They were integrity and peace. She was no longer running from a shadow. She was building a future. The final act of closure came not from a court or a newspaper, but from a quiet moment of introspection. Clara stood on the balcony of her father's old study, the room where the micro-cassette was found, looking out over the city. She allowed herself to feel the bitterness of the past for one last time. The betrayal, the isolation, the sheer terror of starting over. But the bitterness was now contained, edged by a profound sense of purpose. She had delivered the justice their father deserved, and in the process, she had found her own strength. The price of vengeance had been her soul's peace for 10 years, but the reward was the discovery that she was, in fact, strong enough to rebuild the legacy of the man she loved. 10 years had passed since the downfall of Vivian Thorne. Clara Thorne, her legal name now proudly reinstated, was not just the CEO of Aegis Global, but a celebrated figure in global business, known not for ruthless cuts, but for ethical innovation and employee-first policies. She had honored her promise, rebuilding the company on a foundation of integrity and restoring every wrong Vivian had committed. The Arthur Thorne Charitable Foundation was thriving, a testament to a legacy finally free of shadow. Clara made one final, profound journey. She drove 3 hours upstate to the minimum security federal facility where Vivian was incarcerated. She didn't seek forgiveness or an apology. She went for absolute, unvarnished closure. The meeting room was sterile, separated by thick, reinforced glass. Vivian, now in her late 60s, was a shell of her former self, the hard lines of her face softened by prison life, the arrogance replaced by a dull, tired resignation. "You came," Vivian said, her voice thin and reedy. "I came to tell you goodbye," Clara replied, her voice calm and firm. "I don't hate you, Vivian. The hate was a tool I used to get here. Now, it's just ballast, and I'm letting it go." Vivian tried one last time, a pathetic grasp at manipulation. "You took everything. Our father loved you more. That's why I did it." Clara shook her head slowly.
"No.
Our father loved both of us, but he trusted me. He tried to save you, even in the end, by leaving you the company, hoping it would make you whole. But he knew you were incapable of love, so he prepared a path for me. You didn't steal the company because he loved me more. You stole it because you were terrified of failure, and you killed him because you were terrified of being found out." She stood up. "I didn't just take the company back, Vivian. I fixed it. I restored his name. And I found my own life again. You have nothing left to take from me." She turned to leave, but stopped at the door, turning back for a final word, not of anger, but of clarity. "Do you remember the micro-cassette bye-bye? The one that started all this?" Vivian nodded slowly, her eyes wide with a flicker of the old paranoia. "I never told you what was on the final part of that tape. He didn't just say, she forged it. He spoke directly to me one last time. He said, 'My greatest fear, Clara, is that her hate will make you hateful. Don't let the theft of money also be the theft of your soul.'" Clara looked at her sister one last time, a woman utterly consumed by her own toxic ambition, and then she walked out, leaving the cold, sterile room and the wreckage of her past behind her. Years later, Clara stood on the balcony of her office, the old corner office that was now hers, the city lights glittering below her. She was not bitter, not hateful. She was successful, happy, and truly free. The revenge was complete. Her father's final words, delivered through the crackling static of an old tape, had been her true inheritance, a shield against the darkness. Justice had been delivered, the legacy had been redeemed, and the bitter path of vengeance had ultimately led, not to bitterness, but to peace.